There are moments in life when you see someone suffering and you simply cannot walk away. In the spring of 1883, an elderly widow named Evelyn Tate was living in a torn tent on the edge of Cold Creek, Montana. She'd lost everything when her husband died and left behind nothing but gambling debts. Most folks in town looked the other way. Then Samuel Boone, a quiet mountain man, rode into town and saw her struggling to keep warm by a dying fire. He didn't ask permission. He simply said, "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." What happened next would test whether kindness could survive in a town ruled by greed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cold Creek, Montana had seen better days. Once a thriving mining town during the silver rush of the 1870s, it now stood as a testament to broken dreams and faded prosperity. The winter of 1883 had been particularly cruel, claiming livestock, hope, and more than a few souls who simply couldn't endure another season of hardship. Spring arrived late that year, reluctant and cold, as if even the seasons had lost faith in the valley. The main street told the story clearly enough. Half the storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and their signs hanging crooked on rusted chains. The bank had closed the previous November. The assayer's office sat abandoned, its door swinging open in the wind like a mouth caught mid-scream. What remained of Cold Creek's population, perhaps 200 souls on a generous count, moved through their days with the practiced numbness of people who'd stopped, expecting things to get better. Evelyn Tate had arrived in Cold Creek 23 years earlier, as a bride of 19, her hand clasped tight in Thomas Tate's weathered palm. They'd built a modest ranch 5 miles outside town, raised cattle, and lived the kind of simple, honest life she'd always imagined for herself. Thomas had been a good man in those early years, hard-working, gentle with the animals, tender with her. They'd tried for children, but the good Lord had other plans. Perhaps that was when the loneliness first crept into Thomas, settling into the empty spaces where laughter and small voices should have been. The gambling started slow, a friendly game of cards at the saloon on Saturday nights, then twice a week. Then whenever he could slip away, Evelyn noticed the change gradually, the way you notice the seasons turning. One day you realize the warmth is gone, and you can't quite recall when it left. Thomas grew distant, secretive. Money meant for feed or repairs disappeared. He made promises he couldn't keep, borrowed from men who didn't forgive debts. When Thomas died last autumn, thrown from a spooked horse, though some whispered he'd been drunk, Evelyn discovered the true depth of their ruin. The ranch, the land, even the furniture in their home had been signed over as collateral for debts she'd never known existed. Clayton Mercer, who seemed to own half of Cold Creek already, held most of the papers. He gave her 3 days to vacate. She'd sold what little remained, her mother's china, Thomas's tools, even the winter stores she'd put by, and still it wasn't enough to rent a room. The boarding house was full anyway, its owner struggling to collect rent from those already living there. Martha Hayes at the general store had offered her a cot in the back room, but Evelyn couldn't accept. Pride, perhaps, or the last shreds of dignity that kept her spine straight when everything else had crumbled. She'd thanked Martha kindly and bought a canvas tent with the last of her money. The tent sat on a flat patch of ground about a quarter-mile from the edge of town, sheltered slightly by a stand of cottonwoods that followed the creek bed. It was a poor shelter, patched and worn, barely large enough for her bedroll and the small trunk that held everything she still owned. The spring winds came down from the mountains each evening, cutting through the canvas like it was paper. She kept a fire going when she could gather enough wood, rationing her movements and her energy like a soldier on campaign. Evelyn was 62 years old. Her hands, once soft and quick at needlework, had grown gnarled and stiff from the cold. Her hair, completely silver now, she kept pinned up in a simple bun. Her dress was clean but faded, mended in a dozen places with thread that didn't quite match. On her left hand, she still wore her wedding ring, a simple gold band that Thomas had worked a full month to afford. She'd been offered $5 for it last week by a traveling merchant. She'd refused. Some things you don't sell, no matter how hungry you get. Most days, she walked into town to fetch water from the public pump, carrying 2 buckets that grew heavier with each trip. She'd pick through the refuse behind the general store with Martha's permission, salvaging bruised apples and vegetables too far gone to sell. Sometimes Martha would leave a small package on the back step, cornmeal, a bit of salt pork, a candle, and Evelyn would accept these gifts with quiet gratitude and burning shame. The townspeople treated her with the uncomfortable kindness reserved for the destitute. Some nodded in passing. Others looked away. A few offered words of sympathy that changed nothing. They had their own troubles, their own debts to Clayton Mercer, their own fears about the coming winter. Charity was a luxury Cold Creek could scarcely afford. It was on a Tuesday in early April when Samuel Boone rode into town. He came down from the high country on a sturdy roan horse, leading a pack mule laden with winter pelts. Samuel was a man of perhaps 50 years, though the mountains had weathered him in ways that made age difficult to guess. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the careful economy of someone long accustomed to solitude. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with grey. His eyes, pale blue and watchful, missed nothing. He wore buckskin and wool, practical clothes made for function rather than appearance. At his hip hung a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath, the handle carved with initials too faded to read clearly. Samuel Boone was known in Cold Creek, though he rarely spent more than a day or 2 in town. He came down from the mountains 3, maybe 4 times a year to trade his pelts and furs, buy supplies, and then disappear back into the high country. He kept a small cabin somewhere up near Timber Pass, people said, though no one could say exactly where. He didn't cause trouble, didn't drink, didn't gamble, spoke only when necessary and never more than required. Some folks said he'd been an army scout back before the war. Others claimed he'd lost his family to cholera and taken to the mountains to escape the memory. A few of the older residents remembered when he'd first arrived in the territory nearly 20 years back, with a young wife and baby daughter. Then one winter they'd taken sick, both of them, fever that wouldn't break, and Samuel had ridden 3 days through a blizzard trying to get them to a doctor. He'd arrived too late, buried them in the spring when the ground thawed. After that, he'd built his cabin high in the mountains and mostly stayed there. Samuel conducted his business at the general store, exchanging pelts for credit and filling a list of supplies: coffee, flour, salt, tobacco, ammunition. Martha Hayes treated him with the same brisk efficiency she showed everyone, but there was a softness in her voice when she spoke to him. She'd been there that terrible spring when he'd buried his family. Some grief marks you, makes you part of a silent fellowship of loss. As Samuel loaded his supplies onto the mule, his gaze drifted toward the edge of town, where smoke rose thin and grey against the afternoon sky. He paused, his hands stilling on the rope he was securing. Martha followed his eyes. "That's Evelyn Tate," she said quietly. "Lost her husband last fall. Lost everything else, too. She's been camped out there since February." Samuel said nothing, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's a hard thing," Martha continued, measuring her words. "She's a proud woman, won't accept much help. But winter was cruel to her, and spring isn't being much kinder." Samuel finished securing his load, then swung up onto his horse. He sat there for a long moment, looking toward that thin column of smoke. Then he touched his hat brim to Martha and turned his horse not toward the mountain road, but toward the cottonwoods and the creek. He found Evelyn kneeling beside her fire, trying to coax life from a handful of damp kindling. The wind kept scattering her efforts, blowing smoke into her face. She coughed, tried again. Her hands trembled slightly, from cold or hunger or simply exhaustion. Samuel couldn't tell. He dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her. When his shadow fell across the fire ring, she looked up with a start, one hand instinctively moving to her chest. "I didn't mean to frighten you, Ma'am," Samuel said, his voice low and rusty from disuse. "Saw your smoke. Thought you might need better kindling." Evelyn rose slowly to her feet, brushing ash from her dress. She was a small woman, made smaller by hardship, but she held herself with a dignity that suffering hadn't broken. I'm managing well enough, thank you. Samuel glanced at the struggling fire, the patched tent, the meager supplies visible through the open flap. He saw everything in a single sweep of those pale blue eyes. When he looked back at Evelyn, his expression was unreadable, but something in his stillness suggested he'd made a decision. "You'll sleep under a roof tonight," he said quietly. No question in it. No room for argument. Evelyn stiffened. "I don't need—" "There's an old cabin behind the livery stable," Samuel continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Been empty for years, but the bones are good. I'll make it right. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I can't accept. It's not for accepting or refusing, ma'am. It's just what needs doing." He touched his hat brim, the same gesture he'd given Martha. "I'll be starting tomorrow at first light." Before Evelyn could protest further, Samuel swung back onto his horse and rode toward town, leaving her standing by her dying fire with words still caught in her throat. Samuel returned at dawn, just as he'd promised. Evelyn heard the sound of his horse before she saw him, the steady clip of hooves on hard ground, the creak of leather and wood. She emerged from her tent to find him already dismounting near the old cabin behind the livery stable, a canvas pack slung over his shoulder and tools hanging from his belt. He didn't call out to her or wave. He simply acknowledged her presence with a slight nod and began his work. The cabin was in worse shape than Evelyn had realized. She'd passed it countless times over the years without really seeing it, just another forgotten structure in a town full of them. Now, watching Samuel circle it slowly, testing boards with his boot and examining the roofline, she saw it through his eyes. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Several window panes were shattered, leaving dark gaps like missing teeth. The roof sagged in the middle where snow had pooled and rotted through the shingles. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and somewhere inside she could hear the rustle of small animals who'd made it their home. But Samuel had been right about one thing. The bones were good. The frame was solid pine, the foundation stones still level and true. With work, it could be made livable again. Evelyn walked closer, her arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill. "Mr. Boone, I truly don't think—" "Samuel," he interrupted quietly, pulling a crowbar from his pack. "Just Samuel." "Samuel, then." She tried again. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask." He positioned the crowbar under a rotted board and pulled. The wood came away with a groan, revealing the solid timber beneath. "I offered." "But why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Samuel paused in his work, the crowbar still in his hands. He looked at her directly for the first time that morning, and something in his pale blue eyes made her breath catch. Not pity. She couldn't have borne pity. Something else. Recognition, perhaps. The kind that only comes from shared understanding of loss. "I know what it's like," he said simply. "To have everything taken. To feel like the world's moved on and left you standing in the cold." He turned back to the cabin. "I know what it's like to be offered help and be too proud to take it. And I know what it costs, that pride." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She stood there watching him work, feeling something shift inside her chest, a small crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. "If you want to help," Samuel said, not looking at her, "there's a broom inside the livery. Cabin's going to need sweeping once I get the worst of the rot cleared out." It was an invitation, not a command, a way to let her participate rather than simply receive. Evelyn recognized it for the kindness it was. She nodded, though he wasn't looking, and went to find the broom. They worked through the morning in companionable silence. Samuel stripped away the damaged boards and replaced them with lumber from the mill. He'd arranged credit there, he mentioned casually, from pelts he'd traded. Evelyn swept out years of accumulated dust, mouse droppings and dead leaves. The physical labor felt good after months of idle desperation. Her muscles ached, but it was an honest ache, the kind that came from building rather than merely surviving. By midday, they'd made visible progress. The cabin's interior was clear, the worst of the exterior damage removed. Samuel had started on the roof, replacing rotted shingles with practiced efficiency. Evelyn had gathered wildflowers from the creek bank and placed them in a tin cup on the cabin's front step. A small gesture, but one that made the place feel less abandoned. It was while Samuel was on the roof that the rider approached. Evelyn saw him first, a man on a black horse, moving with deliberate slowness down the main street. He wore a fine suit despite the dust of the road, and even from a distance she could see the glint of a watch chain across his vest. Her stomach tightened with recognition even before she could make out his face. Clayton Mercer. He was a man of about 40, with dark hair slicked back and a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't quite soften the hard lines of his face. He'd come to Cold Creek 15 years ago with money from back east and an instinct for other people's weakness. He'd bought the failing mine for pennies on the dollar, then sold it to investors for a fortune before it collapsed completely. He'd loaned money to desperate ranchers and farmers, always with interest rates that ensured foreclosure. He owned the land office, the largest saloon, and held mortgages on half the buildings in town. Some called him a businessman. Others had less charitable names. Samuel climbed down from the roof as Mercer dismounted. He moved unhurriedly, but Evelyn noticed how his hand rested near the knife at his belt, not threatening, just aware. "Mr. Boone," Mercer said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I heard you were back in town. Didn't expect to find you playing carpenter, Mr. Mercer." Samuel's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Mercer's gaze shifted to Evelyn, and she felt the weight of his appraisal. "Mrs. Tate, I'm sorry to see you're still struggling. If you'd reconsidered my offer to purchase your wedding ring, I could extend more generous terms now." Evelyn's hand instinctively covered the ring on her finger. "The ring isn't for sale." "Pity." Mercer turned his attention back to Samuel. "I assume you're aware this cabin sits on disputed property?" "Disputed how?" Samuel asked. The land was part of the original town plat, true enough. But when the mining company folded, certain parcels were sold to settle debts. "I hold the deed to this section." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket, but didn't offer it for inspection. "The cabin, such as it is mine." "Funny," Samuel said mildly. "Town records show this land was designated for public use. Community property." Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Town records are often incomplete. My deed supersedes any earlier claims. Then you won't mind if I examine it. I mind very much sharing my private business documents with strangers." Mercer refolded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "However, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand Mrs. Tate's situation is difficult. If she were willing to come to an arrangement, perhaps service work at one of my establishments, I could allow her to rent the cabin at reduced rates." The offer hung in the air, like something foul. Evelyn's face flushed with anger and humiliation. Everyone knew what service work at Mercer's establishments meant for women without resources. "She won't be needing your arrangements," Samuel said, his voice gone quiet and cold in a way that made even Mercer take half a step back. "She'll be staying in this cabin, and I'll be making it livable. You have a problem with that. You can take it up with the territorial court." Mercer's expression hardened. "I could have you arrested for trespassing." "You could try." Samuel met his gaze steadily. "But Sheriff Hartley knows me. Knows I don't make trouble. Might be he'd want to see that deed of yours before he takes action. Might be other folks in town would want to see it too, if you're claiming property that's always been held in common." For a long moment, the two men faced each other in silence. Evelyn could feel the tension crackling between them, like heat lightning before a storm. Then Mercer smiled again, all teeth and no warmth. "You're new to the politics of Cold Creek, Mr. Boone. I'd hate to see you make enemies unnecessarily." He swung back onto his horse with practiced grace. "Mrs. Tate, my offer stands. When you tire of charity and pride, you know where to find me." He rode away without looking back, but the threat lingered like smoke. Evelyn found she was trembling. "He'll make trouble for you now. For both of us. Let him try." Samuel picked up his hammer and returned to work. "Man like that counts on folks being too scared or too tired to stand up. That's how he's taken half the town. But the deed might be real. Might be paper and ink." Samuel positioned a new board and began nailing it in place. "Either way, you need a roof." I aim to see you have one. Evelyn watched him work, this strange man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Why are you really doing this, Samuel? He paused, hammer raised. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. 20 years ago, I rode 3 days through a blizzard trying to save my wife and daughter. When I got to town, every door was closed. Every room was full. Nobody had space, they said. Nobody could help. By the time I found a place that would take us in, it was too late. He drove the nail home with 3 solid strikes. I learned something that winter. Sometimes the difference between living and dying is just one person willing to make room. One person who sees suffering and doesn't look away. He met her eyes. You're not dying in a tent outside this town. Not while I can do something about it. Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself in months. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel nodded and returned to his work, but something had shifted between them, a foundation laid that was stronger than timber and stone. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Evelyn moved her few belongings from the tent to the cabin. It wasn't finished. The windows still needed glass, the door still hung crooked, and the roof leaked in 2 places. But it had walls and a floor, and the promise of better days ahead. She made a small fire in the old stone hearth, and discovered it still drew properly. Samuel had left a bundle of firewood by the door, along with a sack of supplies from the general store. Coffee, beans, bacon, a small tin of peaches. No note, no expectation of thanks. Just quiet provision. Evelyn sat by the fire that night, warming her hands and feeling the walls around her like an embrace. Outside, the wind still howled down from the mountains. But for the first time in half a year, she was warm. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt something that might, with time and tending, grow into hope. She looked down at the wedding ring on her finger, the simple gold band that had survived everything. Thomas had been a good man once, before his demons took hold. He'd loved her in his way, and she'd loved him. But that life was gone now, buried with him in the Cold Creek Cemetery. This cabin, this unexpected kindness from a mountain man who understood loss. This was something new, a beginning she hadn't dared to imagine. As the fire burned low and sleep finally came, Evelyn made a quiet promise to herself. She would not waste this chance. She would not let pride or fear or shame make her small. Whatever came next, whether Mercer's threats or the harsh realities of frontier life, she would face it, standing upright, under a roof, with dignity intact. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start helping with the repairs in earnest. She might not have Samuel's strength or skill, but she had hands that could work and a will that hadn't broken yet. Outside in the darkness, Samuel Boone made his own camp near the livery. He'd sleep rough tonight, and for however many nights it took to finish the cabin. He'd learned long ago to travel light, to need little, to expect nothing from the world. But watching the smoke rise from the cabin's chimney, seeing light in those windows for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost in the mountains. A sense of purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to stay. He pulled out his tobacco pouch, soft leather made by his wife's hands decades ago, and rolled a cigarette in the darkness. The leather was worn smooth now, but he kept it close always. A reminder of what he'd lost, and why it mattered to help others hold on to what they had. Tomorrow he'd finish the roof, then the windows, then the door, and when the cabin was whole and sound, he'd decide whether to head back to the high country or stay a while longer in this broken town that seemed to need fixing almost as much as the old cabin did. The stars came out above Cold Creek, cold and bright and infinite, and in the space between the mountains and the valley, 2 lonely people found the first threads of connection that might, given time, weave into something worth holding on to. The work on the cabin fell into a rhythm over the following days. Samuel arrived each morning just after sunrise, his arms loaded with lumber or tools or whatever the day's task required. Evelyn met him with coffee, weak but hot, brewed over the hearth fire. They didn't waste words on greetings or pleasantries. They simply worked. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher. When Evelyn expressed frustration at her inability to help with the heavier repairs, He showed her how to mix mortar for chinking the gaps between logs, how to prepare wood for finishing, how to read the grain when cutting shingles. She absorbed these lessons quietly, her hands remembering skills she'd thought lost to arthritis and age. "You've done this before," Samuel observed one afternoon, watching her apply mortar with steady, practiced strokes. "My father was a carpenter back in Ohio," Evelyn said. "I used to help him when I was young, before it became unseemly for a girl to do such work." She smiled at the memory. "He used to say good craftsmanship was about respect. Respect for the materials, respect for the person who'd use what you built, respect for the work itself." Samuel nodded. "Your father was a wise man." "He was." Evelyn's hands paused briefly. "He didn't want me to come west. Said it was too hard a life for a woman, too far from everything civilized and safe. I thought I knew better." She resumed her work. "I suppose he was right in the end." "You've survived," Samuel said simply. "That takes its own kind of wisdom." As the cabin took shape, Evelyn began to contribute in other ways. She organized the interior space, scrubbed years of grime from the floors and walls, and fashioned simple curtains from flour sacks Martha Hayes had quietly provided. She planted herbs in a small patch of cleared ground near the door, sage and thyme that would help with cooking and healing. She mended Samuel's spare shirt without asking, simply presenting it to him one morning with the torn seam neatly sewn. He held the shirt for a long moment, running his thumb over her careful stitches. "You didn't need to do that. You didn't need to build me a cabin," she replied. "Sometimes we do things anyway." Martha Hayes proved a quiet ally in their efforts. She never spoke openly about supporting them. That would have drawn Mercer's attention, but supplies appeared regularly. A cast-iron pan for the hearth, a bag of cornmeal, candles, seeds for the garden. Once, a small jar of honey with a note tucked underneath, "For your coffee. You've earned something sweet." The townspeople began to take notice too. The blacksmith, a burly man named Tom Garrett, stopped by one morning and left a set of door hinges by the cabin step. "Found these in the back of the shop," he said gruffly. "No use to me, but figured they might fit that door of yours." He was gone before Samuel could offer payment. Young James Porter, whose farm bordered the creek to the north, arrived one afternoon with his wife Sarah. They were in their late 20s, worn thin by hard work and harder luck. Sarah carried a basket covered with a cloth. "Mrs. Tate," she said shyly, "we heard about what Mr. Boone is doing. It's a good thing, a right thing. We wanted to help, but we don't have much." She lifted the cloth to reveal fresh bread and a small crock of butter. "It's not much, but it's everything," Evelyn said, taking the basket with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, both of you." James shifted his weight, his hat clutched in his weathered hands. "We've got troubles of our own, truth be told. Mercer's claiming our farm too. Says my pa signed papers before he died. We got 2 weeks before he takes possession." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't know what we're going to do." Samuel had been working on the roof, but he climbed down now, wiping sawdust from his hands. "What kind of papers?" "Loan documents, supposedly. But my pa never borrowed from Mercer." "He wouldn't have. He knew what kind of man Mercer was." James's jaw tightened. "But we can't prove it. The bank records burned in a fire last year. It's our word against his deed." "Same as here," Samuel said quietly. He glanced at Evelyn, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't just about one cabin or one widow anymore. This was a pattern, a systematic plundering of the weak by the strong. "You still got those 2 weeks?" "Yes, sir." "Then don't give up yet. Sometimes the answer's in the details, in the places people don't think to look." Samuel's voice carried a weight of experience. "I'll see what I can find out." After the Porters left, Evelyn found Samuel staring toward town, his expression troubled. "You've done more than enough already," she said gently. "You don't have to take on the whole town's troubles." "Maybe not." He picked up his hammer again. "But I know what happens when good people stand by and do nothing. The bad ones win. They always do, unless someone makes a stand." That evening, after the day's work was done, Samuel told Evelyn more about his past. They sat on the cabin's new front step, watching the last light fade from the sky. He spoke slowly, as if each word had to be pulled from some deep well inside him. He'd been an army scout during the Indian Wars, he said. Not the kind of work he was proud of now, but he'd been young and needed purpose. He'd learned tracking, survival, how to read the land and the sky. He'd seen violence and caused some of his own. When the wars ended, he'd tried to settle down, marry, build a normal life. He'd met Catherine in Kansas City, a schoolteacher with a quick laugh and gentle hands. Their daughter Emma had been born 2 years later. "We came west for a fresh start," Samuel said, his voice distant with memory. "Catherine wanted to teach in a frontier school. I wanted land where we could raise Emma away from the cities, away from the noise and the crowds. We were happy for a while." He paused, rolling a cigarette with practiced movements. "The fever came in winter. First Catherine, then Emma. I'd seen soldiers die of worse wounds and survive, but this thing, it just burned through them. I rode for help, but the blizzard came down hard. By the time I found a town that would take us, Emma was already gone. Catherine lasted another day." Evelyn reached out and placed her hand on his. "He didn't pull away. I buried them when spring came," he continued. "Built them a proper marker up near Timber Pass, where the wildflowers grow thick. Then I built my cabin as far from people as I could get. Figured if I stayed away from folks, I couldn't lose anyone else. But you came back," Evelyn said softly. "You came down from your mountain." "I did." He looked at her then, his pale blue eyes reflecting the last of the daylight. "Because I realized something. Staying away doesn't stop the hurt. It just makes you forget what you're living for. Catherine and Emma, they wouldn't want me hiding. They'd want me doing what's right, helping where I can. They'd be proud of you," Evelyn said. "I'm proud of you." Samuel squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow I need to ride out to the Porter farm, see what I can learn about these land claims. You'll be all right here?" "I'll be fine," Evelyn smiled. "I've got walls and a roof now, remember? I'm practically living in luxury," he chuckled, a sound she'd rarely heard from him. "Luxury might be overstating it, but we'll get there." After Samuel left to make his camp by the livery, Evelyn sat alone in her cabin, listening to the fire crackle and pop. She thought about his story, about the family he'd lost and the grief that had driven him into the mountains. She thought about Thomas and the slow dissolution of their marriage. She thought about all the ways people carried their pain, the different shapes sorrow took, but mostly she thought about the warmth of Samuel's hand in hers and the way his voice had softened when he spoke of his daughter. She thought about the quiet strength he showed, not in violence or domination, but in his simple commitment to doing what was right. She pulled out her recipe book, a small, worn volume her mother had given her on her wedding day. The pages were yellowed now, spotted with flour and grease stains that marked years of use. Her mother's handwriting filled the margins with notes and adjustments, small pieces of wisdom passed down through generations. Evelyn opened to a blank page at the back and began to write. Not a recipe, but a record. She wanted to remember this, the rebuilding, the unexpected friendship, the slow return of hope. She wanted to mark this moment when her life had begun to change, when kindness had reached through her despair and pulled her back toward the light. Outside, the spring night settled over Cold Creek. Somewhere in the darkness, Samuel Boone lay under the stars, his tobacco pouch clutched in one hand and his knife close to the other. Somewhere to the north, James and Sarah Porter lay awake in their bed, counting down the days until they'd lose their home. And somewhere in his fine house on the hill, Clayton Mercer sat at his desk, reviewing deeds and making calculations, planning his next acquisition. The stage was set. The players were in position. And tomorrow, the real struggle would begin. Mercer's response came swiftly and with calculated precision. 3 days after Samuel's midnight visit to the Walker house, a town meeting was called. The notice went up on every public board and in the window of every business, a formal gathering to discuss property rights and recent disturbances to the peace. Everyone knew what it really meant. Mercer was making his stand. The meeting was held in the largest space available, the saloon Mercer owned. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small raised platform. where Mercer stood alongside Sheriff Tom Hartley and two men nobody recognized, lawyers from Helena. By their dress and bearing, Samuel and Evelyn arrived together, taking seats near the back. Martha Hayes sat with them, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by grim determination. The Porters came in shortly after, James's arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Other families filtered in, Hendersons, Walkers who'd been displaced, and a dozen more who'd suffered under Mercer's schemes. But there were also Mercer's supporters, business owners who depended on his patronage, workers who drew wages from his enterprises, and those who simply feared crossing him more than they hated his methods. When the room was full, Mercer called the meeting to order. He looked every inch the successful businessman in his fine suit, his voice smooth and reasonable. Thank you all for coming. I've called this gathering because disturbing rumors have been circulating through our community. Rumors that question the legitimacy of legal property transactions. Rumors that encourage trespassing and theft. His gaze found Samuel in the back row. These rumors have been spread by outsiders who don't understand our town's history or respect our established order. I'm here tonight to set the record straight and to warn against the dangers of believing false accusations. He gestured to the lawyers. I've brought Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Webb from Helena to verify the authenticity of all property deeds currently held in my name. They've examined the documents thoroughly and found them to be legally sound and properly executed. One of the lawyers, Cartwright, tall and severe, stepped forward. I can confirm that every deed Mr. Mercer holds contains proper signatures, witness marks, and official seals. Any claims to the contrary are baseless. Samuel felt Evelyn tense beside him. This was the play they'd expected, using legal authority to intimidate and confuse. But they'd prepared for it. He stood slowly, drawing every eye in the room. May I ask a question? Mercer's smile didn't waver. Of course, Mr. Boone, though I'm not sure what a temporary visitor to our town could add to this discussion. I'm curious whether Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Webb examined the original documents, or merely copies provided by you. Samuel's voice carried clearly through the room. And whether they compared the signatures to known samples of the deceased party's handwriting. Cartwright's expression flickered with annoyance. The originals were presented to us, and we found no reason to doubt their authenticity. Then you wouldn't object to a federal investigation doing the same, with samples provided by the families in question. Samuel let the question hang in the air. Because I've already written to the Territorial Land Office requesting such an investigation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mercer's smile finally cracked. You've done what? I've documented 8 cases of suspicious property transfers, all following the same pattern. Loans that families claim they never requested. Signatures that differ subtly from known samples. Foreclosures that happened with unusual speed. Samuel pulled a folded envelope from his coat. I sent the letter 3 days ago. I expect federal investigators within the month. The room erupted in competing voices, some supporting Samuel's action, others condemning it. Mercer raised his hand for silence, his composure visibly strained. You had no right to involve federal authorities in local matters. I had every right. Land fraud is a federal crime, especially when it involves territory property. Samuel's voice hardened. And I have evidence that your claims are built on forged documents. Lies. Mercer's control finally slipped. This is slander pure and simple. Sheriff Hartley, I want this man arrested for defamation. Sheriff Hartley, who'd been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. He was an older man, gray-haired and weary, caught between the law he'd sworn to uphold and the power that controlled his salary. On what specific charges, Mr. Mercer? He's accusing me of criminal fraud without evidence. That's defamation under territorial law. Actually, I have evidence. Samuel produced the copied pages from the ledger. This is a record book found on property you claim ownership of. The handwriting matches the signatures on multiple contested documents. It's either a practice ledger for forgery or a record of transactions that never actually occurred. Martha Hayes stood. I have evidence too. Documents that show my husband's signature was forged on a loan he never took out. Her voice shook slightly but held firm. I've kept silent out of fear, but I'm done being afraid. One by one, others stood. James Porter, Mrs. Henderson, 3 other families who'd lost property, each one adding their voice to the growing chorus of accusation. The tide in the room was turning, and Mercer could feel it slipping away from him. "This is a coordinated attack on a respected member of our community," he said, trying to regain control. "Orchestrated by a drifter who's manipulated vulnerable people into believing fantasies." "I'm not vulnerable," Evelyn said, standing now. Her voice was quiet, but carried a strength that made people lean forward to hear. "I'm angry. I'm angry that my husband was driven to despair by debts that may not have been real. I'm angry that good families have lost their homes. And I'm angry that you've ruled this town through fear for far too long." She held up her left hand, showing the simple gold wedding ring. "You offered me $5 for this ring, Mr. Mercer. You knew I was desperate. You counted on it. But what you didn't count on was someone showing me kindness without expecting payment. Someone reminding me that I had worth beyond what you were willing to steal from me." The silence in the room was absolute. Even Mercer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Sheriff Hartley cleared his throat. "I think, Mr. Mercer, that you should make those original documents available for proper examination. And I think we should wait for the federal investigators to arrive before any more property changes hands." It wasn't an arrest or even an accusation, but it was the first time anyone in authority had questioned Mercer publicly. The crack in his armor was showing. Mercer's face darkened. "This isn't over, not by a long way." He looked directly at Samuel. "You've made a serious enemy today, Mr. Boone." "I've made an enemy of injustice," Samuel replied calmly. "I can live with that." The meeting broke up in chaos, arguments and discussions spilling out into the street. But something had shifted fundamentally. The people of Cold Creek had seen that Mercer could be challenged, that his power wasn't absolute. And once that seed of doubt was planted, it would be very hard to uproot. Walking back to the cabin that night, Evelyn slipped her hand into Samuel's. He looked down at their joined hands, then at her face, and saw the same mixture of fear and hope he felt in his own chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait, and we prepare for whatever Mercer does next." He squeezed her hand gently. "But we do it together." Above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of human ambition and justice. But to the 2 people walking beneath them, those dramas were everything. The retaliation came that same night, swift and brutal. Samuel had just bedded down in the livery when he heard the crash of breaking glass from the direction of the cabin. He was on his feet instantly, knife in hand, running through the darkness. The cabin's windows had been shattered, both of them. Rocks lay scattered across the floor inside, and through the broken panes he could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond. 3 or 4 men on horseback, already retreating toward town. Samuel started after them, but Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Samuel, don't!" She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but composed. "They want you to chase them. They'll be waiting somewhere with weapons and darkness on their side." He stopped, breathing hard, fury warring with reason. She was right, of course. This was meant to provoke him into a mistake. "Are you hurt?" "No, I was still awake, heard them coming. I got behind the stone hearth before they threw the rocks." She looked at the destruction, glass glittering on the floor, cold wind pouring through the broken windows. "It could have been worse. It could have killed you." Samuel's voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. "If you'd been sleeping—" "But I wasn't." She placed a hand on his arm. "We knew Mercer would strike back. This is just the beginning." They spent the next hour boarding up the windows with planks Samuel retrieved from the livery. It was temporary. They'd need real glass to make it right, but it would keep out the wind. As they worked, neither spoke of the obvious truth. This was just a warning. Next time might be worse. Morning brought another surprise. Martha Hayes arrived at the cabin breathless and agitated. "Samuel, Evelyn, you need to see this now." She led them to the general store, where a small crowd had gathered. Someone had posted notices on every storefront in town. Printed in block letters, "Notice. All persons found to be supporting or harboring the agitators, Samuel Boone and Evelyn Tate, will have their credit revoked and their leases terminated. By order of the Cold Creek Business Association. There is no Cold Creek Business Association, Martha said bitterly. It's just Mercer making it sound official. He's trying to isolate us, Samuel said. Cut off our support. It's working too, Martha admitted. 3 families have already told me they can't help anymore. They're afraid of losing everything. As if to punctuate her words, Tom Garrett the blacksmith approached, his expression apologetic. Samuel, I can't let you use my forge anymore. Mercer owns the building I lease. He'll put me out if I help you. Samuel nodded, understanding. It's all right, Tom. You've got to protect your family. But the rejections kept coming throughout the day. The miller wouldn't sell them grain. The carpenter wouldn't provide lumber. Even Jack Drummond at the saloon, who'd been quietly supportive, told them he couldn't serve them anymore. By evening, they were back at the cabin, taking stock of their dwindling resources. The isolation was meant to break their will, to force them into leaving town or surrendering to Mercer's terms. It was a tactic as old as human conflict. Starve out your enemy, cut their supply lines, wait for desperation to do what force cannot. We need to finish the repairs ourselves, Evelyn said practically. Before the federal investigators arrive, we need to show that we're not going anywhere, Samuel agreed, but he knew it would be harder now. Without access to materials or support, they were truly on their own. That night, as he lay in his bedroll, he found himself reaching for the soft leather tobacco pouch Catherine had made him so many years ago. Her stitching was still perfect, the leather worn smooth by constant handling. He thought about what she would say if she could see him now, involved in a town's struggles, fighting against corruption, forming attachments he'd sworn never to make again. She would have approved, he thought. Catherine had never been one to walk past suffering or ignore injustice. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Samuel was examining the cabin's foundation when he noticed something odd. One of the stones had shifted slightly from the night's vandalism. Behind it there was a gap he hadn't seen before. A hiding place, perhaps, built by whoever had constructed the cabin decades ago. "Evelyn," he called. "Come look at this." They pulled the stone free together, revealing a small cavity in the foundation. Inside was a metal box, rusted but intact. Samuel pulled it out carefully and carried it into the cabin where the light was better. The box's lid resisted at first, then gave way with a squeal of corroded hinges. Inside were papers, old documents, yellowed with age but remarkably preserved. Samuel lifted them out one by one, reading by the morning light. "What are they?" Evelyn asked. "Letters, and something more." His hand stilled on a particular document. "Evelyn, this is the original town charter, from when Cold Creek was founded." He spread it carefully on the table. The document was official, complete with territorial seals and signatures. It detailed the original land grants and the town's founding principles. But what caught Samuel's attention was a specific section about community property. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "All properties designated for public use, including but not limited to the community hall, medical facilities and residences for widows and orphans, shall remain in trust to the town in perpetuity and shall not be subject to private sale or seizure." The cabin, Evelyn breathed, was designated as a widow's residence. "Right here, in the original charter," Samuel's finger traced the words. "It can't legally be owned by Mercer or anyone else. It belongs to the town trust." But there was more. As they dug deeper into the box, they found letters, correspondence between the town founder and the territorial government. And one letter in particular made Samuel's blood run cold. It was addressed to the founder from a man named William Tate, discussing investment in the town's development. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It matched Thomas Tate's handwriting that Evelyn knew so well. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, staring at the letter. "This is dated 1862. Thomas and I didn't come to Cold Creek until 1860, and he was just a simple rancher. He didn't have money for investments. Samuel examined the letter more closely, then pulled out another document from the box, a photograph, faded and water-stained. It showed several men standing in front of a building under construction. One of them was unmistakably a younger Thomas Tate, and standing next to him, his hand on Thomas's shoulder, was a man who could only be his father, William Tate, the town founder. "Your husband was the founder's son," Samuel said quietly. "He was heir to half the property in this town." Evelyn sat down heavily, the photograph trembling in her hands. "He never told me. In 23 years of marriage, he never said a word." More pieces fell into place as they read through the documents. William Tate had died in 1865, leaving everything to his son Thomas. But there was a codicil. The inheritance was conditional on Thomas maintaining the town's founding principles and protecting the community properties. If he failed in that duty, the properties would revert to territorial control. Another letter revealed what had happened. Shortly after William's death, a young businessman named Clayton Mercer had arrived in Cold Creek. He'd befriended Thomas, encouraged his gambling, and systematically manipulated him into signing away properties. But Thomas had never actually owned most of what he'd signed away. They were trust properties that couldn't be legally transferred. Mercer had falsified records, hidden the original charter, and built his empire on fraudulent claims. When Thomas had finally realized what he'd done, the guilt had destroyed him. His gambling had grown worse, a form of self-punishment. He'd drunk more, isolated himself, let his real property, the ranch, fall into genuine debt. He died knowing he'd betrayed his father's legacy, Evelyn whispered. "That's why he was so distant those last years. That's why he couldn't look at me." Samuel found one final letter, written in Thomas's hand and addressed to Evelyn. It had never been sent, never been finished. It began, "My dearest Evelyn, I have done terrible things. I let a snake into our garden, and now I cannot drive him out. Mercer has documents I signed in foolish trust, and he uses them to steal from families who deserve better. I have betrayed my father, betrayed this town, and betrayed you most of all. I'm too weak to fight him, too ashamed to confess. If you are reading this, I'm gone, and perhaps that is best. You deserve a better man than—" The letter ended there, unfinished. Thomas had died before finding the courage or the words to complete his confession. Evelyn held the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Samuel put his arm around her shoulders and let her cry. He understood grief, understood the complicated pain of loving someone who'd made terrible mistakes. Catherine and Emma had been innocent victims of circumstance. But Thomas had been both victim and perpetrator, manipulated by Mercer, but also complicit in his own destruction. After a long while, Evelyn wiped her eyes and looked at Samuel. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" "It does." Samuel gathered the documents carefully. "This proves Mercer's claims are fraudulent. Not just the cabin, but probably half the properties he holds. And it proves he's been operating this scheme for over 20 years. Will it be enough to stop him? Combined with everything else we've gathered?" "With the federal investigation coming." Samuel allowed himself a small, grim smile. It might just break him completely, but even as he said it, he knew that cornered animals were the most dangerous. Mercer had built his entire life on fraud. Exposure didn't just mean legal trouble, it meant losing everything. A man facing that kind of loss would fight with desperate ferocity. "We need to keep these documents safe," Samuel said. "And we need to get copies to the federal investigators the moment they arrive." That night, they hid the originals in a new location, buried in a sealed container beneath the garden plot. They kept copies at the cabin, but the originals would be protected even if Mercer's men destroyed everything else. As they finished securing the documents, Evelyn paused. "Samuel, there's something else we need to consider. That photograph, it had someone else in it. A young girl standing with my husband. I didn't recognize her, but she had your eyes." Samuel had seen the girl too, though he'd been reluctant to mention it. He pulled the photograph out and studied it in the lamplight. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 years old, standing proudly next to Thomas Tate. And yes, she had Samuel's pale blue eyes, his cheekbones, his stance. "That's Emma," he said softly. "My daughter." I didn't know she'd ever met your husband. When was this taken? Samuel turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, Cold Creek, summer 1863, building the new church. Emma was 9 then. We lived in the territory, but I was away scouting most of the time. He traced his daughter's face with one finger. Catherine must have brought her to town while I was gone. Maybe they knew the Tates. Maybe. He stopped, a new realization dawning. If Catherine and Emma had known William and Thomas Tate, if they'd been connected to the founding family, then his family's death might not have been simple tragedy. Mercer had been active in Cold Creek even then. If he'd seen them as threats to his schemes. We're connected, Evelyn said quietly. Your family and mine. Across decades and grief and everything that's happened. We were always meant to find each other, to finish what they started. Samuel looked at her, this strong woman who'd survived loss and hardship and was now fighting for justice alongside him. And he understood that this was never just about a cabin or a widow in need. This was about legacy, about honoring the dead by protecting the living, about two broken people finding purpose in each other and in the fight against corruption. Then we'd better win, he said. For all of them. Word of the discovered documents spread through Cold Creek like wildfire through dry grass. Samuel and Evelyn hadn't intended to reveal what they'd found. They'd planned to wait for the federal investigators, but Martha Hayes had been present when they'd first opened the box. She'd seen the charter, understood its implications, and despite their warnings about discretion, the news had leaked. By evening, half the town knew that the original founding documents had been discovered. By morning, everyone knew, including Clayton Mercer. He came to the cabin just after dawn, but this time he wasn't alone. Bull Harrison rode beside him, along with 2 other hired men that Samuel recognized from around town. They were armed, rifles visible in their saddle scabbards, though they made no threatening moves. Yet Samuel met them in front of the cabin, his own rifle leaning casually against the doorframe within easy reach. Evelyn stood in the doorway behind him, visible but protected. "Mr. Boone," Mercer said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I understand you've been spreading more lies about my property holdings. I've been sharing the truth about the town's founding documents," Samuel corrected. "Documents that prove most of your claims are fraudulent. Documents that you allegedly found in a convenient hiding place, with no witnesses to their discovery." Mercer's smile was cold. "Forgeries, obviously. Crude attempts to discredit legitimate business holdings. Mrs. Hayes witnessed the discovery," Evelyn said from the doorway. "As did I. And the documents have official territorial seals that can be verified. The ramblings of a desperate widow and a shopkeeper are hardly credible. Witnesses?" Mercer's horse shifted restlessly, sensing its rider's tension. "I'm here to offer you one final opportunity. Leave Cold Creek today. I'll provide travel money and a letter of reference. In exchange, you turn over whatever forged documents you've created and cease your campaign of defamation." "And if we refuse?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then I'll be forced to take legal action. Defamation, trespassing, theft of property. I have witnesses who'll testify you broke into the Walker house and assaulted Mr. Harrison here. That alone is enough for a jail sentence." Bull Harrison nodded, his face set in grim satisfaction. His testimony would be perjury, but with Mercer's influence over the local court, it wouldn't matter. "The federal investigators will see through your lies," Samuel said calmly. "They'll examine the real evidence, interview the real witnesses. Your empire is built on sand, Mercer. It's just a matter of time before it collapses. Federal investigators." Mercer's laugh was bitter. "Do you really think the territorial government cares about property disputes in a dying mining town? They'll send some junior clerk who'll spend 3 hours reviewing my perfectly legitimate documents and then leave. If they come at all, they'll come," Samuel said. "And when they do, you'll face justice." "Justice." Mercer spat the word like a curse. "I'll tell you about justice. I came to this territory with nothing. I built a fortune through intelligence and hard work. I saw opportunities others missed and I took them. That's not fraud, Mr. Boone, that's business. You built your fortune on stolen land and forged documents, Evelyn said, her voice steady and clear. You manipulated my husband, drove him to despair, and then stole from his widow. That's not business, Mr. Mercer, that's evil. For a moment Mercer's mask slipped completely. Samuel saw pure hatred in his eyes, directed at Evelyn with frightening intensity. Then the mask returned, smooth and controlled. You have until noon to leave town, Mercer said. After that, I won't be responsible for what happens. They rode away, but the threat lingered like smoke in the air. Samuel watched them go, then turned to Evelyn. We need to prepare. He's not going to wait for federal investigators or legal processes. He's going to act, and soon. What can we do? We need allies, real ones who'll stand with us no matter what Mercer threatens. Samuel checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded. And we need to get word to the territorial authorities that we're in danger. If something happens to us, at least there'll be a record of why. They spent the morning visiting families, the Porters, the Hendersons, Martha Hayes, and a dozen others who'd suffered under Mercer's control. The message was simple. The final confrontation was coming. Stand together now, or surrender forever to tyranny. The responses were mixed. Some, like James Porter, pledged immediate support. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. We're with you. Others were more hesitant. We've got children to think about, one farmer said. If Mercer comes after us, he already has, Samuel interrupted gently. He's been coming after all of you for years, just slowly enough that you didn't fight back. Now he's cornered. He's dangerous, but he's also desperate. This is our chance to end his control once and for all. By afternoon, they'd assembled a coalition of sorts, 15 families willing to stand publicly against Mercer. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. Enough to show that the town wouldn't be cowed, that ordinary people could find courage when pushed too far. They agreed to gather that evening at the cabin. Safety in numbers and a show of solidarity that Mercer couldn't ignore. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, people arrived in small groups. Families on wagons, single riders, even a few townspeople who'd walked from the main street. Martha Hayes brought food, bread and preserves, cold chicken, a basket of early apples. Others contributed what they could. It became an impromptu feast, a defiant celebration in the face of threats. Children played in the yard while adults talked in low, serious voices about what might come. Sheriff Hartley arrived unexpectedly, alone and looking uncomfortable. The crowd fell silent as he dismounted and approached Samuel and Evelyn. I heard about Mercer's visit this morning, Hartley said. I need to know, are these documents you found legitimate? As legitimate as the badge you're wearing, Samuel replied. Original charter sealed by the territorial government. The cabin, along with several other properties, was designated as community trust land. Mercer has no legal claim. Hartley was quiet for a long moment. He was an old man, worn down by years of compromise and cowardice. But Samuel could see something stirring behind his weary eyes, a flicker of the lawman he'd once been, before Mercer's money and influence had bent him into submission. I've looked the other way too long, Hartley finally said. Told myself it wasn't my business, that property disputes were for the courts. But I've seen what Mercer does to people. I've seen families broken. He looked at Evelyn. I was there when Thomas Tate's ranch was sold. Saw the despair in his eyes. I should have questioned it then. It's not too late, Evelyn said quietly. You can still do the right thing, Hartley nodded slowly. If Mercer comes for you tonight, he'll have to go through me first. I can't promise I can stop him. He's got more men and more guns. But I can make sure there are legal consequences if he tries anything. It was a small thing, perhaps. One aging sheriff finding his backbone. But it mattered. It showed that even Mercer's bought and paid for officials could rediscover their integrity when pushed. As evening deepened into night, the crowd remained. People told stories about what they'd lost to Mercer, about small acts of resistance they'd managed, about hopes for a better future. The children fell asleep on blankets while adults kept watch, their vigilance born of both fear and determination. Samuel found himself standing apart from the gathering, looking toward town where lamplight marked Mercer's house on the hill. Evelyn joined him, her shawl wrapped tight against the cooling air. "He'll come tonight," Samuel said. "Men like that can't stand defiance. It eats at them." "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of dying. I've been ready for that since I lost Catherine and Emma. But of failing, of letting these people down, of watching Mercer win because I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to stop him." Evelyn took his hand. "You're not alone in this fight. None of us are. That's what he's always counted on, people being too isolated, too afraid to stand together. But look around us, Samuel. Look at what you've built." Samuel did look. He saw families who'd found courage in collective action. He saw Martha Hayes laughing with Sarah Porter, sharing recipes and hope. He saw Tom Garrett teaching James Porter how to sharpen a blade properly. He saw children sleeping peacefully under the protection of adults willing to risk everything for a better tomorrow. "I spent 20 years in those mountains," Samuel said quietly. "Alone, safe, untouchable, and completely empty. These past weeks fighting alongside you, helping these families. It's the first time I've felt truly alive since I buried my family. Then we fight," Evelyn said simply. "Together, whatever comes." They stood there in the darkness, hands clasped, while behind them the community they'd helped forge waited for whatever the night would bring. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. But down here, in this small corner of Montana, human courage was about to be tested in the oldest way. A confrontation between power and principle, between greed and dignity. Around midnight, Samuel heard it, the sound of multiple horses moving slowly through the darkness. Not the thundering approach of a direct attack, but the careful advance of men trying to remain undetected. He whistled low, a signal the others had agreed upon. Instantly the camp came alert. Men reached for weapons. Women gathered children. Everyone moved to positions they'd discussed earlier. Samuel counted at least 15 riders, maybe more. Mercer had brought his full force, all his hired men, probably some recruited specifically for this night. They stopped just beyond the firelight's reach, a wall of mounted shadows. Then Mercer's voice cut through the darkness. "This is your last chance, Boone. Send out those documents and leave peacefully. No one needs to get hurt." Samuel stepped forward into the full light of the fire. Behind him, the others stood in a line, farmers and shopkeepers, widows and young families. Not soldiers, but citizens willing to defend what was right. "These people aren't leaving," Samuel called back. "This cabin belongs to the town. This land belongs to the community. And your fraudulent claims don't change that. No matter how many guns you bring, then you've made your choice." There was a finality in Mercer's voice, a door closing on any possibility of peace. Sheriff Hartley stepped forward, his badge glinting in the firelight. "Clayton Mercer, as Sheriff of Cold Creek, I'm ordering you and your men to disperse. What you're planning here is attempted murder and unlawful seizure of property. You're a bought fool, Hartley," Mercer snapped. "You work for me." "Not anymore," Hartley said, and there was steel in his voice that hadn't been there in years. "I work for the law, and the law says these people have a right to be here." The standoff held for a long moment, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Then Mercer gave a signal, and his men began to advance. The confrontation Samuel had been dreading was finally at hand. Mercer's men moved forward in a coordinated line, their horses stepping slowly through the darkness. Samuel could see firelight reflecting off gun barrels, could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. These weren't just intimidation tactics anymore. This was preparation for violence. "Hold your positions," Samuel called to the defenders behind him. "Don't fire unless they fire first. Let them be the ones who break the peace." James Porter stood to Samuel's right, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. On his left, Tom Garrett gripped a heavy walking stick, his blacksmith's arms steady and strong. Sheriff Hartley had positioned himself slightly ahead, his own pistol drawn but pointed at the ground. Behind them, the others formed a second line, women and older men, armed with whatever they'd brought from home. Mercer himself rode at the center of his line. And as the horses drew closer, Samuel could finally see his face clearly. Gone was the smooth businessman's mask, the calculated charm. What remained was naked fury and something else, fear. The fear of a man watching his carefully constructed empire crumble. "Last warning, Boone," Mercer shouted. "Stand aside or face the consequences." Before Samuel could respond, a new sound cut through the night, the rattle and rumble of approaching wagons. Everyone turned to see two covered wagons rolling up the road from town, lanterns swinging from their frames. They pulled to a stop between the two groups, and a man climbed down from the first wagon. He was middle-aged and wore a dark suit, despite the late hour and rough conditions. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of official authority. From his coat pocket, he produced a leather wallet and held it up so the firelight caught the badge inside. "I'm Deputy Marshal James Crawford, Territorial Government," his voice carried clearly across the tense space. "And I'll be needing everyone to lower their weapons immediately." The announcement sent a ripple of shock through both groups. Samuel felt relief wash over him, even as he saw Mercer's face go pale. The federal investigators had arrived. Not some junior clerk, as Mercer had predicted, but an actual deputy marshal. "Marshal Crawford," Samuel said, lowering his rifle. "We're glad to see you." "I imagine you are." Crawford surveyed the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Got your letter 5 days ago, Mr. Boone. Been riding hard ever since. Seems we arrived just in time to prevent something unfortunate." "This is a private property dispute," Mercer said, trying to regain his composure. "Not a federal matter. Land fraud across multiple properties in territorial land is absolutely a federal matter, Mr. Mercer." Crawford gestured to the second wagon. "I've brought a clerk and a surveyor. We'll be examining every contested deed in Cold Creek, starting with the ones you hold." Two more men climbed down from the wagons, one carrying document cases, the other with surveying equipment. They looked tired from hard travel, but alert and professional. "We don't need to do this in the middle of the night," Crawford continued. "So I'm ordering everyone to go home. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at the town hall, which I'm commandeering as federal office space for the duration of this investigation. Mr. Mercer, you'll bring all original property documents. Mr. Boone, you'll bring whatever evidence you've gathered." He looked at Sheriff Hartley. "Sheriff, I'll need your cooperation in maintaining order during the investigation." Hartley straightened, his relief evident. "You'll have it, Marshal." Mercer sat frozen on his horse, clearly calculating his options. But what could he do? Attack federal officers? Flee and confirm his guilt? He was trapped, and everyone knew it. "This is a mistake," Mercer finally said, his voice hollow. "Those documents will prove my claims are legitimate." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Crawford replied evenly. "But until the investigation is complete, I'm freezing all property transfers in Cold Creek. No sales, no foreclosures, no evictions. Everything stays as it is." He looked directly at Mercer. "That includes Mrs. Tate's cabin. She remains in residence pending our findings." It was a complete victory, achieved without a single shot fired. Samuel saw the defeat settle over Mercer like a shroud. The man's shoulders sagged, his carefully maintained posture crumbling. 20 years of fraud and manipulation ended by the arrival of federal authority and the courage of people who'd finally stood together. "My men and I will be camping here tonight," Crawford announced, "to ensure everyone's safety. I suggest you all get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day of testimony and document review." Mercer turned his horse without another word. His hired men followed, their earlier aggression replaced by uncertain shuffling. Bull Harrison cast one last look at Samuel, not threatening now, but almost curious, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. As the riders disappeared into the darkness, the defenders lowered their weapons. A cheer went up from the crowd, relief and joy mixing together. Martha Hayes was crying. Sarah Porter hugged her husband. Children who'd been kept back now ran forward, sensing the adults' celebration, even if they didn't fully understand its cause. Samuel felt Evelyn's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. He looked down at her and saw tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears this time, tears of release and triumph. "We did it," she whispered. "Oh, we actually did it." Marshal Crawford approached them, extending his hand to Samuel. "That was some impressive organizing, Mr. Boone, and remarkable evidence gathering." The documents you sent with your letter were very convincing, particularly the handwriting analysis from that ledger. It was a community effort, Samuel said, shaking his hand. These people found their courage. I just helped point them in the right direction. Well, whatever you did, it worked. Crawford glanced back at his wagons. Now, about those founding documents you mentioned in your letter. The town charter and the original land grants. I'll need to examine those first thing tomorrow. We'll have them ready, Evelyn promised. As the marshal moved away to organize his camp, Samuel finally allowed himself to believe it was over. The long fight, the danger, the fear, all of it had led to this moment. Justice wasn't always swift or certain, but sometimes, if you fought hard enough and stood together, it arrived exactly when needed most. The investigation lasted 3 full days. Marshal Crawford and his team worked methodically through every document, every claim, every contested property. They interviewed witnesses, compared handwriting samples, examined seals and signatures with magnifying glasses. They surveyed property lines and cross-referenced deeds with the original territorial records. Samuel and Evelyn presented the founding charter on the first morning. Crawford's clerk photographed each page, while the surveyor verified the territorial seals. The marshal himself read through the entire document twice, making notes in a leather journal. "This is extraordinary," Crawford said, looking up at them. "If authentic, and preliminary examination suggests it is, this invalidates roughly half of Mercer's holdings. The properties designated as community trust can't be privately owned under territorial law." Mercer's lawyers tried to fight back, of course. They argued the charter was a forgery, that the seals were fake, that the document had been conveniently discovered at just the right moment. But Crawford was thorough and impartial. He sent samples to Helena for expert verification. He interviewed Martha Hayes about witnessing the discovery. He examined the hiding place in the cabin's foundation and confirmed it was original construction, not recently added. On the second day, families came forward to testify. One by one, they told their stories, of loans they'd never requested, of signatures that didn't quite look right, of property lost to debt they'd never incurred. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. Mrs. Henderson brought letters her late husband had written, showing his handwriting clearly differed from the signature on Mercer's loan documents. James Porter presented his father's old ledger, proving the family had been debt-free when Mercer claimed they'd borrowed money. Even Tom Garrett produced records, showing he'd never signed the lease. Agreement Mercer claimed gave him control over the smithy. The most devastating evidence came on the third day when Crawford's team examined the ledger Samuel had copied from the Walker house. The original had disappeared. Bull Harrison claimed it had been lost, but Samuel's copies proved sufficient. The handwriting expert Crawford had brought from Helena confirmed the distinctive script matched signatures on 16 different contested documents. "This is systematic fraud," the expert testified. "Someone practiced these signatures repeatedly until they could forge them convincingly. The ledger is essentially a record of their criminal enterprise." Mercer tried to maintain his innocence, claiming he'd been deceived by a clerk who'd handled the documents. But when pressed for the clerk's name and whereabouts, his story collapsed. The mysterious clerk didn't exist. The fraud had been Mercer's own work, conducted methodically over decades. On the evening of the third day, Marshal Crawford assembled everyone in the town hall. The room was packed. Every family who'd testified, plus curious townspeople who'd heard about the investigation. Samuel and Evelyn sat in the front row, with the Porters and Martha Hayes beside them. Sheriff Hartley stood against the back wall, his badge polished and his bearing straight for the first time in years. Mercer sat alone on the opposite side of the room, his lawyers having quietly departed that afternoon. He looked diminished somehow, as if the exposure of his crimes had physically shrunk him. Crawford stood at the front of the room, his journal open before him. "I've completed my investigation into the property disputes in Cold Creek, Montana. My findings are clear and conclusive. Clayton Mercer has engaged in systematic land fraud spanning at least 20 years. He has forged documents, falsified deeds, and illegally seized properties belonging to families and the community trust. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was the official confirmation everyone had been hoping for. Specifically, I'm ruling that the following properties are to be immediately returned to their rightful owners or designated as community trust land. Crawford read from a list, 17 properties in total, including the cabin where Evelyn now lived, the Porter Farm, Martha Hayes's general store, and a dozen others. Furthermore, I'm issuing a federal warrant for Clayton Mercer's arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. He'll be transported to Helena to stand trial in territorial court. Mercer stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't, this is—" But the words died in his throat. There was nothing left to say. His empire had fallen, built on sand as Samuel had predicted. 2 of Marshal Crawford's men moved to either side of Mercer, ready to restrain him if necessary. But he didn't resist. He simply stood there, all fight gone from him, a hollow man facing the consequences of a lifetime of greed. "One more thing," Crawford said. "Given Sheriff Hartley's cooperation during this investigation and his assistance in preventing violence, I'm recommending he continue in his position. He's shown himself capable of putting duty above personal interest when it matters most." Hartley's eyes glistened with emotion. It was redemption of a sort, not erasing his years of compromise, but offering a chance to finish his career with integrity restored. As Mercer was led away in chains, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People embraced, laughed, cried with relief. The weight that had pressed down on Cold Creek for 2 decades was finally lifted. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs again. Free from Mercer's shadow, free to rebuild on foundations of truth rather than fraud. Samuel watched Mercer's departure with mixed feelings. He felt no joy in another man's downfall, even one who'd caused so much harm. But he felt profound relief that justice had prevailed, that the community's courage had been rewarded. Evelyn leaned against him, exhausted but smiling. "It's really over," she said. "It's really over," he confirmed. "Now the real work begins, rebuilding what he destroyed, helping families reclaim their lives. Will you stay?" she asked quietly. "To help with that work?" Samuel looked around the room, at the people who'd become his community, his purpose, his reason for coming down from the mountain. He thought of Catherine and Emma, buried in the high country where wildflowers grew. They would want him here doing this work, helping these people. They would want him to live fully rather than merely survive. "I'll stay," he said, "for as long as you'll have me." Evelyn's smile was radiant. "Then I expect you'll be staying quite a while." Summer came to Cold Creek with unusual gentleness that year. The spring rains had been abundant but not destructive, leaving the valley green and fertile. Wildflowers bloomed across the hillsides in waves of color: purple lupine, yellow arnica, white columbine. The creek ran full and clear, its waters cold and sweet from mountain snowmelt. 3 months had passed since Marshal Crawford led Clayton Mercer away in chains. 3 months of rebuilding, of families reclaiming their properties, of a community rediscovering what it meant to govern itself without a tyrant's shadow. The cabin behind the livery had been fully restored. Samuel had finished the work properly this time. New windows with real glass, a door that hung straight and true, a roof that wouldn't leak even in the heaviest rain. Evelyn had made it a home, with curtains she'd sewn herself, herbs growing in boxes beneath the windows, and her mother's recipe book open on the kitchen table more often than not. But the cabin wasn't just Evelyn's home anymore. True to her word, she'd opened it to others in need. An elderly prospector who'd lost his claim lived in the small room Samuel had added to the back. A young widow with 2 children stayed in the loft until her own house could be repaired. The cabin had become what it was always meant to be, a place of refuge, a community resource, a symbol of how things should work when people put care above profit. Samuel had built his own small place nearby. Nothing fancy, just a 1-room cabin with a good stove and a comfortable bed. But he spent most of his time at Evelyn's place, helping with repairs, sharing meals, and sitting on the porch in the evenings to watch the sun set behind the mountains. Their relationship had deepened into something neither quite knew how to name. Not quite courtship. They were both too old and too scarred for the fumbling romance of youth. But more than friendship, there was tenderness between them, understanding, the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd faced danger together and emerged intact. "You should marry her," Martha Hayes said one afternoon, catching Samuel alone at the general store. "Everyone can see you're in love with each other. Might as well make it official." Samuel had stammered something about respect and proper timing, but Martha had just laughed. "Proper timing? You're both past 60 years old. How much time do you think you have to waste?" He'd been thinking about it ever since. Not the formal marriage part, that would come if it came, but about what it meant to love again after loss. About whether it was betrayal or honor to Catherine's memory. About whether his heart, which he'd thought permanently frozen, had somehow thawed in the warmth of Evelyn's presence. The town had changed in other ways, too. With Mercer gone, new businesses were opening. A young couple from Denver had purchased the old hotel and were renovating it. A doctor had arrived, setting up practice in one of the former saloon buildings. The school had reopened with Sarah Porter as the new teacher. She'd been educated back east before her marriage and had always dreamed of teaching. James Porter had reclaimed his farm and was working to expand it. He'd asked Samuel for advice on managing the land, and they'd spent several days riding the property, discussing irrigation and crop rotation and sustainable practices Samuel had learned over his years in the wilderness. "You should consider running for town council," James had suggested. "People trust you. They'd listen to your ideas." But Samuel had declined. He wasn't meant for politics or public office. He was a man of action, not words, better with his hands than with speeches. Besides, the town needed to learn to govern itself, not just trade one strong man for another. Sheriff Hartley had grown into his redemption. He enforced the law fairly now, without fear or favor. When disputes arose, he mediated with patience and wisdom. He'd never be a great lawman, perhaps, but he was an honest one, and that was enough. On a warm evening in late June, Samuel and Evelyn sat on the cabin porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. The sounds of children playing drifted from a nearby yard. Somewhere, someone was playing a fiddle, the music sweet and melancholy. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about Thomas. But what he tried to do at the end, leaving me that letter, trying to confess his mistakes." "He loved you," Samuel said. "That much was clear. He did, in his way. But he loved his guilt more and his shame. He couldn't forgive himself, so he couldn't move forward." She turned to look at Samuel, her silver hair catching the last light. "I don't want to make that mistake. I don't want to hold on to loss so tightly that I forget to live." Samuel understood what she was saying without her having to spell it out. "Catherine would have liked you," he said quietly. "She always said the measure of a person was how they treated others when they had nothing to gain from kindness. You would have been friends, I think. I would have liked her too." Evelyn reached over and took his hand. "But she's gone, Samuel. And Thomas is gone. We're the ones who are here, who are still living. We get to choose what comes next." He looked at their joined hands, hers small and age-spotted, his large and calloused, and felt something settle in his chest. A sense of rightness, of completion. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it, ever since he'd climbed into the mountains 20 years ago. Not isolation or safety, but purpose. Not forgetting, but honoring the past by fully inhabiting the present. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Not just in Cold Creek, but here with you. If you'll have me." Evelyn's smile was soft and sure. "I thought you'd never ask." They sat there as night fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. Around them, Cold Creek settled into evening. Children called home for supper, lamps lit in windows, the day's work done and tomorrow's not yet begun. It was an ordinary night in an ordinary town, which made it extraordinary in its own way. Proof that kindness could still triumph, that communities could heal, that two broken people could find wholeness in each other. Samuel thought about the long road that had led him here, the grief and the wandering. the isolation, and the slow return to human connection. He thought about Emma and Catherine, resting in their graves among the wildflowers. He hoped they knew, somehow, that he'd found his way back to living, that he'd honored their memory not by hiding from the world, but by helping make it better. "Tell me about your father," Samuel said. "The carpenter from Ohio," and Evelyn did, her voice warm with remembered affection. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of people long gone but not forgotten, building their own history together, one conversation at a time. By the time they finally said goodnight, Samuel walking the short distance to his own cabin, Evelyn closing her door against the mountain cold, both of them knew something fundamental had shifted. They had found what they hadn't dared to hope for, a second chance. Not at youth or innocence, but at belonging, at being seen and valued for exactly who they were, flawed, scarred, but still capable of love and courage and hope. The elderly widow was no longer sleeping in a tent on the edge of town. The mountain man no longer hid from the world in the high country. They were home, in a place, in a community, and most importantly, in each other's presence. And if that wasn't the ending they'd expected when this story began, it was the one they'd earned through kindness, through standing together against injustice, through refusing to surrender their dignity even in the darkest times. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, crops to tend, repairs to make, a community still healing from years of exploitation. But they would face those challenges together, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends and friends who'd become family. For now, under the vast Montana sky, with the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, two people who'd thought their stories were finished discovered they were really just beginning a new chapter. And in the quiet satisfaction of that realization, they both found peace. The cabin door closed with a soft click. The fire in the hearth burned low but steady. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Cold Creek once more, it would shine on a town transformed, not by one man's heroism or one woman's suffering, but by the collective courage of ordinary people who decided that decency was worth fighting for. That, in the end, was the real story. Not about a widow and a mountain man, but about what becomes possible when human beings remember their basic obligation to care for one another. When they choose community over isolation, justice over convenience, and hope over despair. The rest, as they say, was just the beginning.